the focus of this talk is essentially to see how we can make use of content security policy to detect client-side attacks and how we can actually do it in a very practical way. So there would be less of information about CSP itself and more about the strategy that you can actually take to utilize CSP for your applications. Now, this is the rough outline of the talk. So even before we can get into how you can use CSP, we'll have to first understand if using or putting effort into implementing CSP is even necessary, right? So we'll look at the rise of the client-side attacks in recent times, and then we'll look at how we can use CSP for protecting yourself against these client-side attacks and the actual steps for doing this implementation. So if you look at the security status of your applications, then your server side is usually pretty well locked down. There's a lot of emphasis which is put on both secure coding as well as securing the infrastructure. For example, most developers are aware of SQL injection, code injection, command injection. They're aware of the OS top 10, for example, and there is regular pen testing that takes place. Like a bunch of things. And usually your backend is behind a web application firewall at the very least. If not a commercial one, at least the free WAF which is provided by your cloud vendors, right? So that's the status of your server-side security. On client side, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of emphasis that's been put. In fact, most people do not realize the importance of client-side security itself. And at most, you would see, during a pen test, the pen testers look for cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, and that's about it when it comes to client-side security. And what it does is it creates low-hanging fruit. And if there is one thing that we have seen very clearly with attacks is that attackers typically tend to go after the path of least resistance. So when cloud was new, there was a lot of cloud misconfigurations. So there was a lot of attacks on cloud. And similarly, because there is very little emphasis which is put on the security of your client side, that's something which is being attacked by nefarious elements as well. So in fact, there is a specific kind of attack called as MageCart, which has been in the wild for the last 4 years, and it is very active. It specifically targets e-commerce companies. The nature of the attack itself, if you look at it, it's very, very simple. What the attackers do is they inject a few lines of JavaScript code onto a target application. The technique that they use to inject this code could be different, for different sites. They've managed to use different, techniques, but eventually they inject a few lines of JavaScript code, and when a user on that site, enters their credit card information to go through a checkout process, then this JavaScript would, very easily make a copy of this credit card information that they entered, and then it would send it to their server. So it's a very, very simple attack in concept. And it's entirely client-side based attack. The payload as well as the stolen data never makes it to the server side. And so this has so far led to about several hundreds of millions of credit card details being stolen. And this is largely because there has been less focus on client-side security. And then another thing that we keep hearing about more recently is supply chain attacks, specifically when it comes to NPM. And NPM packages are contain both server-side libraries as well as client-side libraries. So an attacker, if they're able to take over an NPM package, they can have code execution on your client side. So XSS is something which most people think about when they think about CSP and client-side attacks. But then the game has changed. There's a whole lot that's going on the client side, and this essentially, this is something that you'll have to take into consideration, especially if you are a site which is doing some very sensitive things. For example, if you are an e-commerce site, or you're a flight or a hotel booking site, or any site which has some kind of a checkout functionality. So for sites like this, because they're being actively targeted, client-side security becomes very critical. Same goes for payment gateways, if you are a fintech company or a healthcare company, for example, a fintech company would typically, when a user is creating their account on the side, there is a user registration form where the user is entering some very sensitive information, their PAN card, maybe their bank account information, and some other financial details. And similarly, for a healthcare company, the user is entering their healthcare information, which is also very sensitive. And if an attacker has injected JavaScript into that page, then they can very easily skim out all these details, which are very very critical. And this could lead to, of course, a breach of trust as well as compliance issues for the site, and of course it leads to a lot of loss for the users. And specifically, like those are some sites that have to be protected. And in those sites, at the very least, if the entire site cannot be protected, at the very least the checkout pages, the user registration pages, or pages where you are accepting these sensitive details, as well as login pages, or pages where authentication information is being entered, if it includes a password or an equivalent, then those need to be protected with CSP. I'm sorry, those require client-side protection due to these client-side attacks. And when we look at securing your client side, there are a lot of things that can be done. Everything from controlling the resources that are loaded, the JavaScript that is loaded, the behavior of the JavaScript which runs on your page, the integrity of the JavaScript, as well as the flow of data. Like if you accept data from a user, where is this data being shared? We have seen cases where in a registration form, when the user enters their personal information, due to some misconfiguration, that data is captured through an analytics script, and then it is sent to, let's say, for example, Google Analytics, right? So these are all things which you will have to monitor and make sure that it's both in compliance with your data security policies, as well as it's in compliance with your regular security requirements that you've put for your site. But that's the best case scenario. But if you think of, if you were to start somewhere, then my recommendation would be to start with content security policy. CSP is a web standard. It is supported in all the modern browsers, and it's been around for a very long time. There's a lot of information about it, and it gives you, I would say, at least in my personal opinion, it gives you the maximum return on investment in terms of how much effort you would put in and versus how much you can get out of it if you use it properly. It would be the best use of your time and the best starting point as well. So this is what we are going to look at. And when we look at CSP, I'm sure most people already have heard about CSP and have an idea about what that is. But if you're new to this, CSP in its core is essentially a rule which tells the browser what resources it can load and where it can load those resources from. It's a very very simple concept. You can think of it almost like a firewall for the client side. And the way it's in this talk, we would not be talking so much about the syntax of the rule and so on. There's a lot of information available. But as a concept, this is what a CSP is. And the way you would add this policy or add this rule to your website is through a HTTP header. So there is a header which is set by your server. You add a HTTP response header, and then the browser, when the site is trying to load a resource, it would check it against this policy. And if the policy allows a certain resource to load, then it would go ahead and allow it. If not, it would either block the resource from being loaded, or it would let the resource load, but it would create a report saying that, hey, this was a resource which the site wanted to load, but it is not part of your policy. So this is something you might want to investigate. So in a nutshell, if you were to simplify it, that is what CSP is conceptually. And it can be, like I said, put into either blocking mode, or it can be put into monitoring mode, where you're just monitoring your site. So CSP itself is very simple if you look at it as a concept, but the CSP implementations are notorious for being quite complicated. In fact, there are several stories. If you speak to people who have implemented CSPs, they have scars to through their through the difficulty they had implementing it. And it usually happens because people tend to go about it, you can say, in probably not the optimal way. So a lot of people struggle with CSP, but you don't necessarily have to struggle. There's a lot of things you can do by which you can get to a good policy without losing your sleep. And in this talk, we'll actually do a step-by-step overview as to how you can go about to having a good policy for you. So it might not be the best policy, but it could be the best possible policy you can have, practically speaking, given your site's unique characteristics. Okay, so we'll first break down our CSP journey into two stages. The first stage is we'll get to an effective monitoring mode CSP policy. And in a monitoring mode, we'll get complete visibility into what is happening on your site, and that would help us detect client-side attacks. And the best part is this will not have any impact on your site. It will not have any functional impact, and it barely has any performance impact as well, because CSP is a built-in feature on your browser. Even when your browser sends a CSP report, it would put it at a lower priority than the other resources your site loads. So for example, if the site is loading a lot of resources, it would load those resources first, and then only if there is time available, a CSP report would be sent. So the browsers are very smart that way. So even if your CSP policy is sending a lot of reports, it would not have any performance impact on your site. It would if you open up your browser's console, then it would look like the site is loading slow, and that's only because every time there's a policy violation, a message is printed to the console, and that adds a time delay. But then if the console is not open, as it is for most regular users of your site, then there is almost no impact. So we'll look at stage one, how we can get there, and after that we'll look at stage two, where you actually try to go into a blocking mode policy. And with a blocking mode policy, you have the ability. It's far more powerful because you can actually even block attacks. But the downside is it can also block legitimate functionality, and there is a risk of breaking your site. So we'll see how we can work around that. Okay, so in step one, what we'll do is we'll actually create an initial. So this is where we put a monitoring mode policy. So we'll create an initial policy for your site. So a starting point, if you will, and then we will deploy it on the site. So we have actually created a tool for creating this policy. So I have a video of that. I'll quickly show that. So here you can see that we start the policy creation, and that gives us the starter policy. So what we'll do is we'll configure this policy in our own local browser, and then we'll browse the site that we want to monitor. So here I'm using a Chrome extension to essentially add a HTTP response header, and I'm going to put the starter policy as a response header locally. And then I would just browse my site, and that would help me create the policy. So I've added the starter policy here, and I'm going to visit dom.io. So dom.io currently does not have a CSP policy. So you can visit your site, you can access the critical sections of your site. If there's a login page, if there's a registration page, post authentication, you can access those sections of the site which you can say get the most amount of traffic, and the functionalities which are used most of the time. So you can trigger all of that, so that the violations are so that the policy that we would generate covers most of your site. So now, based on my browsing, a policy has been created, and it's a monitoring mode policy. So you can just copy this, and you can deploy it on your server. So this tool would be made available in a couple of days on dom.io. So you should be able to use it to create a policy. And as you can see, it actually took me probably a few minutes to generate this. And once this is done, so what you would actually do is you would configure this policy onto your server. So you can put it in your QA environment first, or your staging environment, and after that, eventually you can put it into your production environment. Because it's a reporting mode policy, it should be okay to go with production, even from the very beginning, because it will not break your site. So once you do this, what will happen is, as your users visit your site, if the site is loading resources which is not part of the policy, then your browser will actually send a violation report. So you need to have some system to capture these violation reports so that you can act on them. You can analyze them, and then you can act on them. So for this, I would actually recommend using a CSP report monitoring service. There are a lot of commercial services available. People sometimes tend to set up their own server and collect this. And yes, you can collect the data, but then the real use of these violation reports is in terms of analyzing them and converting them into actual value. Otherwise, you just have to deal with too much information coming in. So a good report monitoring service should be able to look at all the reports that you get, like all the rough data, and then put it in a very easily consumable manner, so that it's a very easy summary for you. And then it should also be able to generate alerts for you, which is, once you put this policy and then you go about your regular activities, let's say there is a spike in the violations that come in, then you should actually get an alert, so you can actually go and take a look at the alerts that have come in and actually take some action based on that. So this actually makes it very easy for you to go about your CSP implementation. Rather than spending too much time looking at the violations, you only have to get involved when there's an alert which reaches your inbox. So once you have a monitoring service like this, so this is a screenshot from the reports which have been collected for one of the sites that we are currently monitoring. And so here you can see that the type of the violations which came in, they've all been categorized in simple terms. So here you can see that there are some 4-5 domains which are not part of the policy. Let's say, for example, the site is currently load, the CSP policy says the site can load scripts from a.com, b.com, and c.com. But then if the site is loading something from x.com, then that would create a violation. And then the report would say that, hey, your site is loading JavaScript from x.com. And so what we can do is we can see the highest violations first, as in what domains is our site loading content from at a very highly at a fairly high frequency. And we can focus on those. We can take these information and we can actually update our policy. So this would be like a almost like a continuous cycle where you have the policy in place, you look at the violations, and then you take the top violations, and then you update your policy based on that, and then you deploy it again. And once you do it for some amount of time, then you would actually have a good policy deployed. In fact, I can give you a rough estimation of how long it would take. So your initial CSP policy creation itself should only take about 10 to 20 minutes, depending on how big your site is and how much dynamic content it has. And a stable CSP policy is one where your policy covers most of the resources your site is loading, and then not too many violations are being created from your CSP reports, right? So when you get to that state, you can say that you have a stable policy, and that would take anywhere from a week to 2 weeks, depending on how dynamic your site is. When I say dynamic, it means how frequently the content your site loads keeps changing. So as you can see, there's not a whole lot of it doesn't take too long to get to the state. And if you get to this state, then you're already in a very good place, because you get complete monitoring of your client side. You are able to detect client side attacks. You have visibility on your client side infrastructure, and then you achieve all of this without any impact on the site. And more importantly, you are not spending any time on your CSP once your policy stabilizes. Essentially, if you have a monitoring mode policy, and then if it is stable after the first couple of weeks, it is almost a free monitoring service for you. You don't have to spend any more time on it, unless there is a major change to your site, and then there are too many violations. Only then, maybe, if you want to, you can take a look at it. So a lot of people think that having a monitoring mode policy is actually, like a sign of accepting defeat, that they could not go into blocking mode. But if you have a good monitoring mode policy, and then if the reports are being analyzed properly, through a proper monitoring service, then a monitoring mode policy is very, very valuable, and it's a must have. Okay, so now that we have gotten that out of the way, let's get to the next stage, which is where we actually try to go into the blocking mode. Now, blocking mode is definitely a harder stage, and this is because there is a risk that you can actually break your site. So this is where most people typically tend to struggle. They have a report only policy, and then when they try to get to the blocking mode, they run into a lot of problems. And this is because the approach that most people take is they tend to get very ambitious. They have a report only mode policy, as in they have a monitoring mode policy, and then they take the same policy and then they try to put it in blocking mode at at one instance. And that could work if your site is not very dynamic, and then you have management buy-ins where they say, hey, you know what, this is very necessary, you go ahead, do it. If it breaks our site, it's okay. If you have that reassurance from the business side, then you might go and do that. But without it, it's a very, very difficult thing to do. And especially if your site is dynamic, then this is an approach you simply cannot take. You cannot take your reporting mode policy or your monitoring mode policy and put it in blocking mode. So this is the approach most people take, and this is very difficult to do. So we would actually recommend a different approach. Now, not many people know that your browser can support multiple CSP policies at the same time. So this is a built-in feature. So this is something we can actually make use of. And if you actually see some top sites on the internet, they would actually have multiple CSP policies on their site. So what we can do is we have created a monitoring mode policy in stage 1. We can keep the stage 1 process as is, which is we have the policy, we look at the violations if they're very high, and then we update them on the periodic basis. So that's something we can keep operational. And then we can add an additional policy, and this is going to be our blocking mode policy. And what we'll do is we will add items to the blocking mode policy one resource at a time. So a CSP policy has rules for each resource. So you can say for script, what are the sources from where scripts can be loaded? For Ajax calls, you can say what are the destinations to which Ajax calls can be made, and so on. So we will try to add rules to the blocking mode policy resource by resource. And while we try to do this, if, for example, if a resource is too dynamic, let's say, for example, your site is designed in such a way that the domains to which it makes Ajax calls keep changing almost on a weekly basis, then in that case, you don't have to put that particular resource in blocking mode. And this is where people typically struggle, because they take the reporting monitoring mode policy and put it in blocking mode. And just because one resource is very dynamic, they're not able to go to that stage. So if you go resource by resource, then you don't have the problem. If a particular resource, for example, Ajax calls, your site's very dynamic in that respect, then you don't have to put that in blocking mode. You can have it in monitoring mode. You will still have attack detection, and you don't have to worry about breaking your site by trying to put that in blocking mode. So if those resources which do not change so much, which it looks like you can put it in the blocking mode without actually breaking your site, those are the things you could actually start with. Okay, and in terms of scripts, if your scripts are JavaScript that's being loaded on your site is very dynamic, this usually happens where you have 5 or 6 sites on your scripts on your site, and some of these could be analytics or ad providers, and they would in turn go and load like a whole bunch of other scripts on your site. And these other scripts that are loaded, these tend to be very, very dynamic, and there is no way by which you can actually predict what scripts would be loaded. So it's very difficult for you to put a blocking mode policy where you say, hey, I only trust these domains to load scripts on my site. So in those cases, the best option is to use something called as a nonce along with strict dynamic. So there's a lot of information available on the internet as to what is a non-CSP nonce and what is strict dynamic. But as a general approach, if you have, if the script that you're loading, is very dynamic, it's being loaded from a lot of different domains, then you can go for this approach. And with this, you can actually have a blocking mode policy for your JavaScript without the risk of you breaking your site. But this does require a bit of development effort, so that's something you would have to look at. But it would be a one-time activity, and after that you have free blocking mode for your JavaScript, without any additional effort. And then when you're moving items, when you're adding resources which are there in your monitoring mode to your blocking mode, you can start with those resources which have the highest priority, as well as they're the most easiest to move. And you can move those first, and the other resources, either you can move them later, or you can never move them at all, because they're very dynamic and moving that might break your site, you can choose not to move them. So here we have a table where we have captured all the resources in the order of priority. So it starts from your JavaScript, your form submission, Ajax calls, and so on, all the way down to your fonts. And there is a rough estimation of how much time it would actually take for you to put them in blocking mode. For static sites, it typically tends to be 1 week, because in a week you would, the content does not change so much, so you would, you would know what kind of resources, what kind of locations you load these resources from, so you can put them in blocking mode. But for dynamic sites with a lot of dynamic content, where the resources keep changing, the sources of the resources keep changing quite a lot, it would take longer. And for some of the resources, you would never be able to put them in blocking mode, and that is okay. You can have them in monitoring mode, and you would still be good. So this table is part of the presentation, so you can take a look at it later, and you can use it for reference. So that's mostly what I wanted to talk about. So at a high level, I spoke about the problems on client side, how you can use CSP to protect yourself, and I tried to give an approach which has worked for me, because I have analyzed several thousands of CSP policies and deployed CSP policies for different companies, as part of our product DomDog. So these are techniques which have worked for us very well. So these are my recommendations to you. So maybe they work well for you as well. If you want to reach out to me, if you have any specific queries related to CSP, you have tried to implement CSP in your organization, you've had some trouble, or maybe something I've recommended here does not really apply to you, you're looking for some other advice, you can always reach out to me over an email. I'd be happy to give you whatever guidance I can. If you're looking for dedicated training on CSP, that is something that we are providing along with Hasgeek. So you can reach out to the Hasgeek team, and we'll be able to provide trainings on CSP where we cover all the basics for you, and all the implementation techniques. And if you have any specific problems with CSP implementation in your organization, we can resolve those as well during those trainings. So so with that, I'll hand it back to Arjun.
Sure. Thanks, Lava, for that wonderful and insightful talk. I'm sure this has been very helpful for many of our audience here today. Just to get the conversation flowing, right? So let me start by asking. I know you spoke about the need for CSP, right? So that's obviously a requirement that engineers can try to implement. But as I take that case towards the management, just to help them make this case of CSP even stronger, right? Are you aware if CSP is part of any existing security frameworks, or is it driven by any compliance or regulatory requirements, etc., that developers can use as rationale to have the task from management to implement this?
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point. Now, CSP is because there's a lot of mage cut attack taking place, and they typically target checkout pages and so on. PCI DSS 4.0 has made it a requirement to have a client-side security mechanism in place, and it has actually spelled out that CSP should at least be available on content security. On checkout pages, right? So now that's become a compliance requirement, in addition to some other client-side security measures, right? So that is one. And then OWASP has a new project, it's still in the incubator phase, called the client-side security top 10, right? And that includes CSP as one of the items as well. So these are some things which are coming up. PCI DSS 4.0 is already already there, and the client-side security project is in its early stages. So these would be some things which could probably developers or security engineers could use to make a case to the business, in order to justify having to put effort on that.
Excellent. Thanks, Lo. I think even I was not aware that CSP is part of PCI. I think that's definitely a big shift in the way compliance is influencing and driving security requirements. So I think it's a symbiotic relation that they have, and this is definitely going to help drive a lot of things. Especially, I know the fact that you spoke about having CSP on payment pages or sensitive pages. So I think that's a very key link with the PCI requirements. Also, thank you for sharing that. Right. So coming to my next point, I know you spoke about the CSP implementation bit. So it may cause problems, and I've had this kind of feedback and experience as well. So you can consider this question coming directly from me. So it may cause problems like user friction or some hiccups in the UI interface. And ultimately, it also results in an overhead for maintenance of the CSP policy itself, right? Especially when you're putting it in, you can put in block or monitor mode. So and you've worked with many organizations on this. So what would you suggest, or how would you go about finding the right balance between the user experience, the functionality, and the security bit?
Right. Okay. So that's a very practical question, and I'm sure something which most people would have in their mind. Now, the monitoring mode policy itself, I think it's usually like a good place to be at. And like I said, if you have a good report monitoring service, and now the most most report monitoring services which are available on the internet, they all tend to have an alerting mechanism in place. So with that, what happens is you can put this in monitoring mode, and then if there is like a major change on your site, then you would get alerts about, hey, these are some 3-4 things your site is loading, and we're getting a lot of violations about it, and only then you can go and act on it and maybe update the policy. So this is something maybe you only have to do like once a month, once in 2 months at most, right? And with this approach, maintaining your monitoring mode policy becomes relatively easy. It is difficult when a lot of people tend to, and this is a fault of a lot of engineers, which is they try to engineer everything by themselves. So they have their own elastic search instance where they pipe all the violations, and then they try to do their own analysis. So they start off well intentioned with a lot of enthusiasm, but just because of the amount of time they would have to spend looking at it and everything, no one's going to have time to go look at those reports on a daily basis, right? Everybody has their own priority, the teams are stretched thin. So unless you have something which will just tell you, hey, this is something you will have to look at when something big happens, you don't have to spend any effort if you use a proper monitoring a report monitoring service. So that should take care of your monitoring mode policy, right? So I think in today's age, it's very easy to have a monitoring mode policy without fiddling too much with your schedule, right? The next is the blocking mode policy. That of course is very complicated, and there, if you cannot, so there the problem with blocking mode, like I said before, is when you try to just take your monitoring mode policy and put the entire thing in blocking mode, that doesn't work. So we could pick sections of it, like say form submission, and this is something which is a very critical behavior, because your application's data is being submitted, and we see a lot of blocking mode policies do not have form submission, even reporting mode policies. But form submission is something which does not change very often, right? The dynamic changes which happen, very rarely do you include a new third party in form submission, right? Especially on sensitive pages. So you could move things like that to the blocking mode as much as possible. And for JavaScript, again, using nonsense strict dynamic, right? That could help you, because trying to put JavaScript in the blocking mode is probably the highest priority item, I would say. So for that, nonsense strict dynamic could could really help you get there. And if it's a one-time implementation, and once you do it, after that, it actually requires little to no maintenance, unless you are inserting a new script onto your page in HTML. Unless you do that, it does not really take any additional effort.
Excellent. Yeah, I think going back to your points around where you mentioned the step 1 and step 2, and also the effort estimation. I think that slide was very interesting, and it will be very key as developers, scrum masters, or managers think about implementing the CSP policy, right? Because for them, ultimately,
Right.
it's a translation of how much resource and effort it's going to take as part of their
Right.
sprint planning, right?
True.
And I think that will lead me to my next question, right? So
Hmm.
I know you spoke about how CSP is going to help us do a lot of things and what we need to require to have these
Hmm.
security controls in place. But coming to the practical aspects, what would you say, and as per what you've experienced or
Hmm.
dealt with, what would you say are the limitations of CSP? And are there any specific scenarios where you think CSP would be ineffective?
Okay, so, and I presume you're talking in terms of detecting attacks.
Yes, primarily, I think security
Right.
is our primary concern. Obviously, I
Right.
understand that there may be some hiccups with the UI bit and stuff, but
Hmm.
purely
Right.
from a security and mapping that to specific, maybe for example, mapping it to specific technologies like Angular or React,
Hmm.
etc. Right? Is there
Right.
any, because different websites use different tech stacks, right? So
Right.
I think considering that factor before jumping into CSP is also going to be important to determine
Right.
what is the return on investment or how successful they're going to be, right? Because we don't want
Hmm.
our developers to be disillusioned by the fact that CSP is across technology, right? So if there is anything
Right.
specific that you want to call out that
Hmm.
are something like gotchas, right, or something that they need to be
Hmm.
aware of, I think this is a
Hmm.
good point where we can, tell them this is what CSP can do and this is what CSP can't do.
Right. Right. Yeah, that's a very good point. So, I had mentioned that CSP is the starting point, right, of your journey. But then there is a long way to go. There are a lot of other things that we can look at, and they typically tend to focus on the limitations of CSP, right? For example, CSP typically tends to operate, or at least practically, how most people deploy it is it tries to trust an entire domain. It tries to, it tends to trust an entire third party, but then in the third party itself, there is no finer control of the individual resources. For example, when it comes to JavaScript, you could trust say cdnjs.com to load your third party, but then they're like, you have all the script in the world loading from cdsjs.com. And let's say, for example, there's a very old open source library which an attacker has managed to inject some malicious code into, and that's now being served from cdnjs.com. That could very well be injected into your site, and your CSP policy would happily allow it, right? Because it is from a domain which has been allowed. So that's one limitation in terms of how fine-grained the control can be. The other thing is in terms of actually if you're looking specifically at scripts, the integrity of the scripts, right? Which is, you could have a script that you load, and this is something which is attackers have exploited in the past, which is they scan the internet looking for S3 buckets with publicly writable permissions. And once they found those buckets, they tried to look for JavaScript files inside it. And wherever they find JavaScript files, they just injected their own web skimming code into it, right? So now all the e-commerce companies which were loading JavaScript from their own S3 buckets, right? The URL of the script itself is unchanged, but the content of the script has been modified due to no fault of the web developer. This is due to a cloud configuration, which is outside the purview of the developers themselves, right? So that is something which your CSP cannot help with. Maybe something like your sub-resource integrity can help in that case to kind of ensure the integrity of the script's content is maintained. But this is something which CSP cannot help with. And then in terms of data exfiltration, this again comes down to trusting the entire domain. We have seen attackers, once they have stolen the credit card details, in order to send it back to their server, rather than use their own server, they've actually used Google Analytics. So what they do is they send the payload or the credit card information to googleanalytics.com, but then they send it to their Google Analytics account, right? And then they log into the Google dashboard and they get all the credit card details. Now again, your CSP, because it's Google Analytics and the domain is trusted, your CSP policy would happily allow it. So there are a lot of things like this where CSP is a good starting point. So it all comes down to how sophisticated the attack is, right? Uh, I would say about 80% of the attacks can be blocked with CSP, which is a very good start. But then as the sophistication of the attack starts increasing, you start seeing the limitations of what something like CSP can do. And that was not the reason why CSP was designed for also. So that so that's okay as well.
Excellent points, Love. I think you just hit the nail on the head, especially with on the supply chain attacks or digital skimming attacks or the SRI kind of attacks, right? Because I think it's very important to understand what are the capabilities and limitations of CSP so that developers get into this with a more practical and realistic mindset, and they are not get disillusioned by the end results, right? So the next question is probably going to be a little bit of a cover because, especially because you mentioned about SRI, right? So the feedback that I've got from developers sometimes is SRI is much more easier, so I don't need CSP, right? Because we're doing some sort of integrity check. So if you can, very briefly touch upon what is the key differences between having SRI and CSP? Should both exist, or should just one exist, or what are your thoughts on that?
Right. See, I'm a security guy, so are you. So we would always say we should have both. Right. But being more specific, sub-resource integrity and CSP, they kind of solve two different problems, right? If you can have both of them, that is good. But then one, does not essentially negate the need for another. Sub-resource integrity can say that, hey, this specific script that I'm loading, it has to be of this, it has to have this content. It can enforce that, but SRI will not prevent a new script from being loaded onto your page. That's not what SRI is designed for. And similarly with CSP. So I would say the best scenario is having both. And one problem with SRI is especially it's not something you can deploy on a lot of scripts. There are scripts which typically tend to be very static. You can put SRI on that. And like CSP, SRI is also something which companies struggle with sometimes because some scripts tend to be very dynamic. So they'll have to figure out which ones are static, which ones are dynamic, and then deploy it accordingly. So you get into those complications. So yeah, they're meant for two different purposes. The best option is to have both. Having one does not mean that you're good from the other.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, right? Because it's important for us as security professionals to also provide clarity on certain myths that people may have, right? So it's that was an excellent point. So so when I heard you say that you spoke about your step 1, step 2, and also about the effort estimation. So I think for me, some of the takeaway in that was that one, you have, when you're starting off, at least on day 1, you have to prioritize and scope out where you want to apply a CSP policy, right? It may not be as simple as applying it over the entire website, right? You may want to target certain pages which you believe are business critical or handle sensitive data, right? So for me, that is one of the important points, right? Both from the effectiveness of the CSP control and also how that translates to time and effort. So if you want to just quickly recap for in probably a minute or two around what should be the short-term and long-term approach, if you would tell an engineer in 1 minute that this is what you need to do in the short-term and long-term, what would your advice be to them?
Okay, so that's a very good question on a very, very practical term. So I would say what they should aim for is if they have critical sections on their site, like I said, checkout pages, registration forms where they collect sensitive data from users, login pages where there's the password and so on. The best option would be to try to put a blocking mode policy in those sections, and for the rest of the site, have a monitoring mode policy, right? That I think is a very practical and possible goal for them to work towards, and it's also something that's achievable without too much work. Like for example, in our case, for one customer, they started off with the monitoring mode policy throughout the entire site, and now they're slowly adding blocking mode policies to certain sections of the site, and they're starting with the most critical sections. Like they started with just the exact checkout page, and now they're adding, they're going into like all the pages have /checkout/ in the URL, right? And they started with the login page, and now they're going to all the account pages, right? So they're expanding it little by little. So even if you don't get there, just identify your 3 or 4 critical pages, blocking mode there, monitoring mode in the rest of the site. That's easy to achieve, easy to maintain.
Excellent point. I think this is the kind of key insights that developers can take away from this, so that they take a step-by-step and incremental approach rather than trying to boil the ocean, right? So so this brings me to my last question, right? So in security we talk about layered approach, defense in depth, etc., right? So the question is CSP alone sufficient for dealing with client-side attacks, or do you feel there are other supporting or complementary controls that can be put in place as well to deal with client-side attacks, which are simple and easy to implement, like you said, with CSP, and provide maximum ROI?
Right. Okay. So there are. That's a good point. So there are two aspects to it, right? One is in terms of what controls you can have along with CSP. Of course, CSP is, I would consider it to be the first and most important step in your client-side security journey. But there's obviously a long distance to cover, and you could have CSP, you could have sub-resource integrity, for example, and some other things that you would anyway be doing for your site. Let's say, for example, your third-party code approvals. Like if you're using an open source library, right? Having some kind of an approval process for that, that would apply both for your backend as well as for your front end, right? So those kind of good security measures would anyway help you. That would spill over to your client side. In addition to that, specifically on the client side, you can think of all the mechanisms you put on the server side, depending on how mature your organization is. Like, for example, most companies, they would start off with just a WAF, right? And a free WAF which they get from their cloud provider. But as the company starts growing in revenue, because most companies are essentially trying to survive in the first place, right? So security comes later. But once they reach a certain level of maturity, they probably hire their first security engineer, or they start hiring a senior engineer, security resource. They start putting out processes. They start hiring different security mechanisms on the server side. They could have an IDS, they could have an endpoint monitoring system. All these things start coming in one by one as the organization keeps starts growing and starts getting more mature. So you can think of the equivalents on the client side. So you have say an intrusion detection system or an intrusion prevention system equivalent on the client side, a DLP equivalent on the client side, right? Like I said, you have a form where you accept user data. Where is all this data going? So you need some system which can actually do that monitoring, and it can alert you for that. The JavaScript which runs on your pages, are there any keyloggers? Who are the scripts which are doing keylogging? Which scripts are trying to read your user input data? Which scripts are trying to access users' geolocation? Which ones are trying to access the microphone or the camera? There's a whole bunch of whole lot which takes place there. So you can put controls for all of those things as well, even to the point where I'm loading all the script on my pages. Instead of right now, if you think about it, all the JavaScript on your site, it's almost like every program runs with root permissions, because every script has complete access and it has all the rights. Can we do like script level permission control? Can we put some of them in a secure container? Like a lot of things that can go. In fact, Gartner is now tracking client-side security as a new vertical as well, right? So a lot of vendors which have come up because there are a lot of things which can be done here. So I would say as your organization becomes more mature, your budget and other things increase, then there is a lot of things you can explore on some of the things which I have mentioned about. A lot of those things you cannot achieve with the browser standard. You would have to go with a vendor who is providing that, but then there's a lot of things you can do there.
Excellent. I think it's going forward. It's also very important to think about the entire ecosystem of client-side security and not just take a piecemeal approach with CSP or SRI, right? I think it's important for us to think about it holistically. And I think I like the point about you mentioning that different organizations are at different stages in their maturity, at least in terms of security maturity, right? So it's important for them to introspect within themselves and understand where they are on the journey and where they want to be, and then take steps, especially for CSP, right? So, Lava, this has been really a great talk for 1 hour. I think we can continue this conversation for hours on end, but I think in the interest of time, I want to conclude by saying that The key takeaways from this talk have been around how CSP can help to protect against client-side attacks, how we can prioritize the implementation of CSP, what do we need to keep in mind as we start on our CSP journey, and finally, what is the benefit of doing so? I think Lava has provided very good practical insights on that. And I'm also sure that many of us here are inspired to take back these concepts and ideas with us and attempt to implement this in our own organization in order to improve security. Right. So once again, I would like to thank you all for participating in today's talk. You can continue your interaction with the topic and with the speaker at the Hasgeek site, the link that I've pasted in the chat. And you can also participate as a speaker on RootConf too. And you can follow RootConf on hasgeek.com/RootConf to stay updated on further events. And just to let you know, RootConf is also organizing the Cloud Costs Optimization Conference on Friday, 23rd March at the Bangalore International Center. And I think you should definitely participate by subscribing to RootConf. And with that, we conclude the session today. Thank you, Lava. Thank you all, and have a wonderful evening. Goodbye.
Thank you.